It's a voice rarely heard, the voice of a formerly enslaved person. Few know that in the decades following emancipation, interviews were done in an effort to preserve their stories. And in tonight's Prime Focus, you'll hear some of what they said as part of our partnership with the 10 Million Names Project. ABC's Alex Berche brings us their stories in their words.
I want you to tell me how you got your name.
I got my name from President Jeff Davis, the President of the Southern Confederation. He owned my grandfather and my father. My grandfather was a blacksmith, and my father had learned how to write a little bit in Richmond, Virginia before he brought him down there.
You're listening to the voice of a formerly enslaved American, a man by the name of George Johnson. This rare and historic audio interview was recorded in 1941, almost 80 years after Mr. Johnson gained his freedom. He and his family worked on a plantation in Virginia owned by Confederate leader Jefferson Davis, a staunch opponent of abolition. In the interview, Johnson recalls a day in the life as an enslaved person.
Did they drive the slaves down there in Davis's Bend very hard, or did they work them reasonable?
Reasonable. You know, Master Joe gave my Jeff another boy, and boy was chopping cotton. Boy didn't kill, but you gang, you understand? He come to hook the boy kill, you understand? That's the house of Master Joe boy. And that's what's the trouble, son. Said, Mr. Don't hook me, because I would kill this gang.
Audio tape interviews like this are striking and uncommon, but are actually part of a long legacy of Black families, communities, and institutions, including historically Black colleges and universities, that lead the way in collecting and preserving the oral histories of the formerly enslaved people in the 19th and 20th centuries. In the 1930s and beyond, technology allowed some of these interviews to be recorded as part of both federal and independent projects. The details are often difficult to hear, but they remind us this history happened not too long ago, with names, faces, and stories. Do we know roughly how many of these recordings exist?
The recordings are relatively rare, but the recordings come from a much larger and really important and in many ways unsung collecting effort that took place. In terms of audio technology, most of it was not recorded by audio because the technology didn't exist, or at least in any kind of widespread accessible way when most of those were conducted. So it's really just a handful of audio recordings we have.
In 1974, a woman named Celia Black, at the age of 114 years old and shortly before her death, recalled picking cotton in Texas as a child born into slavery.
I didn't have to pick cotton or nothing.
I've been doing nothing but work in the field. Work in the field, oh goodness. When my husband would go out west and pick cotton. Go out west every year. We've been this year going out there picking cotton.
One of the things that kind of struck me when you have an interview recorded in 1974, for some Black Americans, I mean, they're one generation removed from slavery.
In some ways, we think of slavery as ancient history. We think of it as something that happened a very long time ago to people we couldn't possibly have known. I was 6, 7 years old in 1974. So it's kind of amazing that we were alive at the same time. I was alive at the same time who was someone who had been born enslaved.
Alex Haley's Roots premiered on ABC just 3 years after this interview with Celia Black.
What's your name?
Kunta Kinte.
Alex Haley came into his work, Roots, what became Roots really, through his grandmother's stories. So we're really talking about oftentimes great-grandparents at this point in the 70s.
Dr. Kendra Field, chief historian of the 10 Million Names Project, and Harvard professor Vincent Brown explained how these recordings illustrate an enormous preservation effort. The firsthand accounts shedding light on the darkest chapters in our American history, yet also revealing incredible African-American strength and survival.
Didn't you have some entertainment doing a dancing or anything?
Oh, I used to dance, but I don't do it now. No, I don't dance now. I try my best to serve my master. I'm trying my best to serve my Heavenly Father.
You hear these recordings. What were the emotions when you hear, the recollections of Celia Black?
First is just the miracle of her survival. It's just that I'm actually hearing this person who had been enslaved. That's kind of a miracle.
Celia Black was alive when Abraham Lincoln was president and lived to see the resignation of President Richard Nixon.
Oh, man.
You remember Abraham Lincoln, President?
Oh, well, they gave him a good name. Oh, Abraham Lincoln. They thought Abraham they thought, everybody thought Abraham was the best president there was.
In a similar effort to preserve this history and legacy, the 10 Million Names Project is a moonshot endeavor that aims to use the power of ancestry research to identify the names of the 10 million men, women, and children who were enslaved in the territory that became the United States. The goal is to put names and faces on this vital history, not only to give the enslaved the dignity they deserve, but to connect those living today with their family's story. With the help of the 10 Million Names genealogist, we were able to find the direct descendants of Celia Black. Yeah. In Rhode Island, we met 68-year-old Curtis Royal, who spent time with her as a young man.
She's my great-grandmother from my mother's side of the family.
Do you remember any of the stories that she would tell?
She told us about how difficult it was, just being alive during that period. And of course, she would tell us a story about the big ox that they had two of them, and how her father would set her right on the head of the ox, and she would just hold on with the horns. So those are, as a boy, those are fascinating. You say, wow.
My grandfather had some big old oxen. He had one with a big wide horns. Oh, it looked like a house. Wide horns, and I used to sit up there and clean them horns. And then his name was Coley. And the other one was named Left.
Was it ever difficult to talk about slavery?
Yes, and I think what made it so difficult is just realizing, how emotional it was and what they went through. You try to put yourself into their physical being and to understand what they went through, and it is scary.
You've heard the recording
Yes.
of your great-grandmother
Yes.
in 1974.
It was very challenging for me to hear when they asked her the question about what it was like working in the fields, the heat in Texas, the humidity, and, sometimes 105, 110 degrees. And I just can't fathom waking up, sun up to sundown, working in the fields. How do they do it? How did they do it?
You learn about slavery in America, and I think especially being a Black American, the initial emotion is anger.
There's the history of slavery as an institution, which was all about oppressing people. And that's a very dark history that I think should make us angry. But then there's an African-American history of survival through and beyond that institution. And that's kind of amazing. To hear people, accepting that I lived this life, it was incredibly hard, and I'm still here, and that I've survived, and I've got children, and I've passed on some kind of legacy.
How does who's conducting these interviews and how they're conducting these interviews, how does that matter?
Oh, I mean, it's enormously important. For the WPA interviews in general, the vast majority are white interviewers. Some are the children of the former slave owners, in fact, that are interviewing a former slave, right, of that same family.
But everywhere, slavery was a system for allocating status. And slaves and ex-slaves were supposed to be low-status people. And so when they were talking to people who they perceived to be of higher status, they had to be very careful about what they said, right? Because those people could determine their fate.
While many of the audio recordings don't reflect it, slaves were frequently subjected to heinous forms of abuse, including beatings, sexual assault, and forms of torture. The historic 10 Million Names Project, in which ABC News is the exclusive media partner, is an ancestry database that the public can access add information to, and use as a research tool. And because so little information about enslaved people was officially documented, amassing this data is a huge task.
We encourage anyone that wants to get involved to reach out, to go to the website, and to be part of that project.
Who stands the most to gain from hearing these? I mean, is it Black folk? Is it younger Black folk? Is it white America? Is it Americans as a whole?
If we're going to understand anything about freedom, then we're going to have to understand the people who were denied that freedom.
I mean,
While very few of us will have the opportunity of hearing our ancestors' voices on tape, the 10 Million Names Project hopes that one day all Black Americans will have the chance to know their ancestors' names and stories the way that Curtis knows Celia.
You had the chance to know your great-grandmother.
Yes.
How powerful is it being able to connect that dot?
It's extremely powerful. You got to hear it from her directly. Not something that was passed on, but to hear it directly from her pain.
Today's topic is going to be on slavery within the Caribbean. Usually when we talk about slavery, we focus on U.S. slavery and slavery as it occurred in the United States. However, slavery was very widespread, not just in North America, but also in the Caribbean and in South America and parts of Central America. Our African heritage and roots really have played a significant role, if not a very major role, in our languages we speak, in the cultures that we celebrate, in the way that we carry ourselves, in the traditions that we still carry today, even in the stories that we tell as Caribbean people in terms of folklore. We still carry on so many traditions brought by our African ancestors. So between 1526 and 1867, approximately 12.5 million African slaves were kidnapped from their land and transported to the New World. Approximately 10.7 million of that 12.5 million survived the Middle Passage and actually made it to the New World. That means that approximately 2 million African slaves did not make it between being kidnapped from Africa and making it to the New World, and so they died during the Middle Passage. It was probably the most gruesome parts of being transported from Africa to the New World. The slaves were packed like sardines underneath the ship in what is called the slave deck. They were chained, they were starved. Epidemics ended up spreading throughout the slave ships, and many slaves caught dysentery, smallpox, fever. Mothers were separated from their children and husbands were separated from their wives. People committed suicide. Many people were killed as a result of disease and also as a result of brutality. Approximately 450,000 Africans were shipped to North America over the span of the slave trade. Brazil received approximately 4.86 million Africans, who were primarily from Angola. And what's important to note is that when we say that they were from Angola, this was usually prior to the Berlin Conference that separated each nation into the nations that we know today. And so when we say Angola in this historical context, we're usually referring to the region in which Angola is present today. So usually we're talking about West Central Africa, if that makes sense. The Caribbean then received approximately 5.39 million African slaves. Many came from West and West Central Africa. The major crop in the Caribbean was sugarcane. Sugarcane was an incredibly sought after crop because from sugarcane comes sugar. Sugar was used in everything, and so sugar became an extremely important export throughout the world. Prior to slavery, there was indentured servitude. We had white indentured servants who were paid at low wages. However, they were required to work a certain amount of time. Many of the European colonizers, including the English, began to realize that importing African slaves would be a more cost-effective way to maintain their plantations and to reap more money for their economy. They were cheaper, their labor was free. In the eyes of Europeans at the time, they figured that because Africans came from this very hot and tropical climate, that they would be able to better survive in the Caribbean, which had a very similar climate and terrain. In 1650, an African slave in the Caribbean could be sold for as low as, in US dollars, $7.84. In the Caribbean, slaves were held in very large units. So plantations usually had approximately 150 slaves or more. In the Caribbean, one of the major issues was slave death rate. Slave death rate in the Caribbean was extremely high, higher than it was in the United States. And that was a major problem. On top of that, the birth rate was very, very low. The fertility rate for a slave in the United States was actually 80% higher than it was for a slave in the Caribbean. And that was due to the fact that working conditions were very, very tedious. To process sugarcane into sugar was a very tedious and very dangerous job. Many African slaves, as a result of the hard working conditions, died. Poor Europeans decided that they would implement something that would help to maintain their survivorship and the livelihood of their existing slaves. They instead began to just import more Africans into the Caribbean. So you had this halt in the natural reproduction, the slave population in the Caribbean. The decrease in the African slave population was approximately 5% each year. Because more African slaves were being imported into the Caribbean as a result of trying to replenish those slaves who had died off, US slaves were more generations removed from Africa than were Caribbean slaves. In the 19th century, the majority of slaves living in the British Caribbean were from Africa. By 1850, most US slaves were either third, fourth, or fifth generation Americans. In 1798, the Amelioration Act was signed into law, and this act enforced planters and slave owners to provide basic needs for their slaves. So it forced plantation owners to provide food, clothing, medical treatment, and also basic education to their slaves. It also prohibited cruel and brutal punishment. It prohibited planters and slave owners from working their slaves more than 14 hours a day. The real reason why the Amelioration Act was signed into law was because a series of rebellions had occurred throughout the Caribbean, from Jamaica to Barbados, Grenada, Haiti being the most notable. And so to kind of decrease and kind of put a cap on the uprisings taking place throughout the islands, they tried to sign the Amelioration Act. The Amelioration Act may have provided certain basic rights. However, the basic right of freedom is far more important than any act that could be signed to kind of ease the pain of actual bondage. So let's move on to talking about plantation life. Many plantation owners gave their slaves the Sundays off. While many were Christians, many others brought their traditions and their religious and spiritual beliefs from Africa. Bringing their own traditions and unique spiritualities and beliefs actually became something that greatly impacted the Caribbean as we see it today. Spiritual beliefs such as Obia, Voodoo in Haiti, you have Santeria, all of these different things actually accumulated after many of the slaves were brought to the Caribbean, and as slaves were introduced to Christianity and were also carrying on their own specific traditions. During Sundays, many slaves used this time to cultivate their gardens that they were granted as a part of their plot of land. And so this garden they would use to grow produce such as plantain, sweet potatoes, and yam. And yes, I did say plantain for my non-Jamaicans, plantain. And so they would grow these things in their gardens to provide for their families, and they would also grow these things so that they could go to market and sell them and make a bit of pocket change for their goods. That also very much so affected the overall culture of West Indian society, because we know that market throughout the Caribbean, doesn't matter where you're from, market is the place of culture. So now I'm going to give you a quick little rundown of the boiling house and the curing house, and this is basically how sugarcane was processed into crystallized sugar that we use today. This is just going to give you a little bit of insight into what it was like for these slaves to actually do such backbreaking work and very dangerous work. First, you have to cut down the sugarcane. That is very tedious work because you have to have very strong arms. It's backbreaking work, and the sugarcane is very heavy. When you cut down enough sugarcane, you carry it then to the mill, and the mill is basically where there's kind of these rolling rods that you feed each sugarcane stalk into. And the person who would do that job, someone called the sugarcane feeder. There was always someone standing right next to the cane feeder who had a machete in their hand. And the person with the machete in their hand was standing there with the unique purpose of, in case the person who was feeding the cane into the rolling pins got their hand stuck into the pin, there was no way to release it unless you cut it off with a machete. And so after the mill, it goes straight to the boiling house. And so the boiling house is made up of these huge metal vats known as clarifiers. And these clarifiers had the sugarcane juice, they had ashes thrown in, and also lime to help purify it, and it was heated, boiling hot. Hence why it's called the boiling house. It was very hot, and it kind of made this liquid then into a syrup. It took a very skilled individual to be able to work in the boiling house. They were known as boilers. Their job as boilers was extremely important, but also extremely dangerous. Because they worked such long hours and because they worked in such sweltering heat, if they were not careful. There have been many stories in which boilers actually either burned by the liquid or actually fell in. Afterwards, the juice was then heated and moved through a series of vats called copper. These were huge metal basins that basically aided in thickening the cane juice. Then when the sugar was close to crystallizing, it was poured into wooden barrels or clay molds that were set over pots in a building called the curing house. In the curing house, water would be poured on top of these molds and the syrup would basically drain through the vessel, and you would have crystallized golden brown sugar as we use today. In regards to the slave quarters, homes were usually huts or what we call wakalanda houses. Basically a home made out of thatches, plantain leaves, or even palm leaves for the roofing to help the rain just kind of roll off the roofs so that it doesn't penetrate through the house. So I'm not going to go into too much detail, but as I stated earlier, slave rebellions were very prominent throughout the Caribbean. I'm just going to list a few of the slave rebellions that took place throughout the Caribbean in response to slavery. So Taki's Rebellion took place in 1760s Jamaica. The Haitian Revolution took place, and that was the only successful slave revolt in the Western Hemisphere and led Haiti to becoming the first free Black republic. Fiden's Revolution took place in 1790s Grenada. In 1816, Barbados had a slave revolt led by Bussa, and in 1831, a huge slave revolt was led in Jamaica by Samuel Sharp. This led to Britain actually thinking about abolition because there was just a series of revolutions and revolts that were taking place throughout the Caribbean, and they could not risk the weakening of their economy and then not being able to export sugar throughout the world. So the British slave trade officially ended in 1807. This made the buying and selling of slaves from Africa illegal. However, of course, though it was illegal, there were a lot of loopholes. For example, the Amistad, if you know the story of the Amistad, I'll leave a link down below if you'd like to learn a little bit more about the Amistad. That's a story that affects both the Caribbean and the United States. It wasn't until August 1st, 1834 that slavery was abolished in the British Caribbean. Though slavery was officially abolished in the British Caribbean in 1834, slaves were still expected in some islands to become a part of a program called the apprenticeship program, in which they still worked for their slave owners, except they were paid at times low wages. And that didn't end until 1838. Though they were technically not slaves anymore, the idea of apprenticeship was more to me almost like slavery by another name. Though they were no longer technically slaves, I can't imagine that they were treated much differently than they were when they were enslaved. You can't just enslave an entire people for more than 300 years and then all of a sudden 4 years of apprenticeship is all of a sudden now this next level to freedom, when in fact they were not completely free. Former enslaved people did not receive any compensation, which is something that people of the Caribbean are still fighting for today, reparations. They also had very limited representation in legislature. After slavery, indentured labor and indentured servitude was reintroduced to the Caribbean, but this time involved Asian indentures. The effects of slavery on the Caribbean, and as we see ourselves today, has been very drastic. African heritage and history and traditions is greatly infused and embedded in the fabric of West Indian culture and heritage. We are very much so connected to our African roots, and for that I'm extremely grateful. However, the stories and the sacrifices of our ancestors as enslaved individuals throughout the Caribbean is something that can never be forgotten. It's not something that we can just turn a blind eye to and ignore. It's something that we have to remember at all times, and though many people will aim to tell us to forget slavery, that's something that you can never forget. And instead of making it something that, oh, well, that happened to my ancestors, if you think about it, you right now and your existence right now pays testament to their survivorship. That is extremely powerful. That's something that is in our DNA. We're royalty. And even before we are the descendants of survivors, we are the descendants of kings and queens who lived in Africa. That is something that, whether you're Black American or Caribbean American or South American with African roots, that's something you should carry with you for the rest of your life, to give you pride, to humble you. That is something that you should have extreme pride in, something that you should take with you no matter what it is that you're doing or where you're going. That is something that encourages you in all of your capabilities. Anything that you set your mind to, you can achieve it because 1, you're blessed. 2, you came from a lineage of strong survivors. You are a testament to the fact that you are the descendants of survivors, of fighters, of kings, of queens, and you are here and you are your own unique individual, and you can accomplish all that you set your mind to.